Today, what we're doing is we are going to finish up what we started last week, or actually 2 weeks ago before the holiday, which was talking about hourly labor, standalone equipment sales. Obviously, there's a little bit more moving parts to this than we could really get through in one single 45 or 50-minute session. This is going to wrap up kind of what we started last session on that topic, which is kind of our part 2 here, which is the hourly labor and standalone equipment sales. We'll touch on the topics that we didn't get to last time. And then coming up, we have a couple of sessions that are really going to be on the core recurring revenues that everybody really should have in their tool belt, what those economics are, why they're important in terms of your overall recurring revenue picture. And these are typically ones that are a little bit less touch. We get the recurring revenue, but we don't have a whole lot once it's installed in terms of ongoing support, remediation, certainly nowhere near the type of ongoing management that we do in IT. So we're going to talk about those the next couple of weeks. Then we're going to get into January right after the holiday. We have a couple of weeks there that obviously everyone will be out. We're going to start in a deep dive into the IT worlds. We'll keep on going down that schedule. I look forward to having you there for that class. All right, with hourly labor and standalone equipment sales, recapping last week, what we really talked about was T and T&M, which is anything that's related to remediation or project labor, really any time that's billed by the hour. And what we had said was that this should contribute before overhead roughly 40% to the contribution line, which is after obviously cost of goods sold and sales expenses, but before we do overhead. And remember, we talked last week, we can control, if we want to control how profitable we are, it's not just the hourly rate. Obviously, if I'm charging $100 an hour and I raise my rates to $110 an hour, I'm hopefully going to make a bit more money. But we have so many other items that we can potentially control to maximize the ability to be profitable when we sell anytime by the hour. And if you recall, those items that we talked about last week were the proper billing minimums, the minimum time. Typically, we recommend an hour. We do have several folks that do a minimum of 2 hours if they're going to roll a truck to go out for any kind of a call, whether it's a service call or project work. The minimum time would be 1 to 2 hours. Billing increments. We showed you an example last week, if you recall, of what happens if we change the increments from billing every 15 minutes to every 30 minutes, or every 30 minutes to just doing full hour increments. That changes your economic picture by quite a bit. And then the last one was actually making sure that we do charge a trip charge when appropriate. Sometimes that's an afterthought, or we think of it as, we're just recovering some cost of actually rolling a truck. But it really does change by a lot your economic result. We kind of showed the example that if we played with the minimums and ended up billing just another half an hour on a 4.5-hour call, that we would increase our profits by 44%. If we also added a small trip charge, we're actually making the additional profit on that call an additional 67%. So an additional 2/3 of the profit you would have made on the same call with the same cost, because you still paid the hourly rate of the same tech to go out there. You didn't change any costs below his salary or anything else for the trucks, the gas, anything else that you do to support the operations team. It all stayed the same. That's a significant amount when you think of it as a percentage of the profit that you would have made. These are all things that really do sometimes have little in our mind in terms of what they might bring to the table, but when you really look at it, the effect on profits is substantial. We got into that. We did mention towards the end, we talked about what the hourly rates are and what they should be. What I wanted to do here was start off today's session really talking and diving deep into hourly rates. Now, obviously, we can go raise our rates if we want to make more money, but it's a little more detailed than that. I wanted to kind of ask each one of you on this call, and I did have 2 people that said that they were going to not be able to make it another engagement, but they were going to watch the recorded version. Just the folks that we have here, why don't we start with Mike? Mike, what is your hourly rate at Comtech?
So we're 180 an hour, but we do it 240 for our first half hour, and that covers our trip. Oh, there you are.
Testing to see if you guys know the answer.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this, Courtney, last week, kind of the same question.
I know the answer because I watched the recording where Courtney answered it.
Yeah. Just your base hourly rate is $180 an hour. Okay.
Correct.
Mr. Stokes over at DTS, how about you? What is just your regular hourly rate for project?
$175 an hour.
Okay, good. Let's see, Mauricio.
After last weekend, we adjusted it.
Oh, okay. Already, huh?
Yeah, because I learned that I was at 125 and I was low.
Okay.
I was at 150. I was low.
What did you raise it to?
175.
Okay. Wow, that's a big jump. Good for you. Okay, and then let's see here. Who else we've got? How about Cindy? Cindy Dursting. What is your hourly rate at Alltech?
We're at 150 an hour.
Gotcha. Okay. David Johnson, what's your hourly rate?
We're 150.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, we have a pretty good range there. The good thing about this group is letting you guys know that at least you guys are all in a positive ballpark, because having your rates in that range of 125, let's say, to 175, 180, you're usually in a pretty good place. But it's going to depend on what your what your average technician rate is. If it's a little higher, if it's a little lower, 125 might be fine, or it might not be enough. The good news is you're in there. When I've done financial classes in the past, usually I've got someone that comes to the class that says, yeah, our rate's $99. It's been that way for years and years, and our customers are used to it. And when I ask them, when was the last time we raised our hourly rates, sometimes I get the answer of, oh, I don't know, 6 years ago. That's the important thing we want to talk about here, is finding our market's true rate and understanding how we go about raising those rates, and then what our rate should be in terms of a relation to the technician salaries that we have, which is another thing we really can't control either. We made an offer to a technician to pay them X dollars an hour. They accepted. That's usually the right rate, because you have an offer and acceptance. We just heard all these hourly rates, and I guess the question I would always ask is, well, what's the correct rate? What should the rate be? Should everybody just be at 180? Is that the right rate to charge? It's hard to know. Ultimately, everybody has this idea that their market is different. If I'm with Comtech and you guys are just outside of Baltimore, and let's say I'm in Davenport, Iowa, I might be tempted to say, well, I can't get those kind of rates because Comtech is in a potentially more urban environment, closer to bigger cities, bigger population. I can't get that kind of rates in Iowa or Omaha, Nebraska, or distant suburbs of other cities maybe. And ultimately, the answer to that is usually the converse will become some folks we have in a very rural area that are getting very good rates. And the folks that are in a larger city, like in Chicago, they might say, well, gosh, they can maybe get that in Springfield, Illinois, but in downtown Chicago, I can throw a rock in any direction, like I mentioned last week, and hit a competitor. So my rates are depressed. Everyone always thinks that their world is different. And if I'm charging 125 and I don't have the gumption of Mauricio, and I might think my customers would never pay that, I can never get 175. And we think that my market won't support that. And what we're trying to do today is basically to show you that that's not true, that your market is usually not different. We all have a different upper market rate, but we have to test to find out what that is. What is the correct rate? Well, each one of us on this call and everyone who's going to be ultimately watching the recorded version has the power within them to figure out what is their market in their city, what should they be charging. We don't want to leave money on the table. If we're to charge 125 and the market rate is easily 150, then obviously for every hour we bill, we're leaving $25 on the table, and that's significant. That does add up. We never want to assume that we're charging market rates without testing the theory. You won't know unless you test it. Another question is, how, that's exactly what I was mentioning how do we know if we're charging market rate? And when was the last time we raised our rates? If you are at 150, that may be a great rate to be at. But if it's been several years since you've discussed making a increase to that rate, it may be time to consider that, because that's how we do this. And what do we do here? We basically say, to find our market's true rate, we really have to test the theory. And how do we do that? Dennis and Scott have been to several of these financial classes, and this used to be a huge discussion when Dale was doing these classes, and then when I did it, about how we raise our rates and when we do it and how we do it. And the answer really here is that we will never know if we're charging enough if we don't ask. What we have to do to find our market's true rate is to have regular small increases every 12 to 18 months. Raise your hourly billing rate by a small amount. And that is crucial for two things. Number one, you want to protect your margins because your costs are increasing over time. You give periodic raises to employees over the years, so your payroll costs are creeping up over time. Gas gets more expensive, operating costs go up over time. Think of any services that you provide, especially recurring services, they tend to raise prices on us wherever. I think of Netflix all the time. It seems like every 45 days they want to raise those rates. But for yourselves, keeping up with inflation, keeping up with the cost of the increasing cost of your business, you really you can't charge 150 5 years ago and charge 150 today and expect to make the same money. Because over those 5 years, I guarantee you that your cost to provide that service has gone up. So we want to protect our margins, but also if we keep doing small increases every 12 to 18 months, then we do increase our profitability. Because if we raise our rates by just a few dollars and a few percentage points, at least in the short term, that's profit that's going directly to the bottom line. Let me ask Mike, and since I've picked on Courtney so much, you're at 180 now. I know you're billing more than that for the first half hour, but let's put that aside. At 180, when was the last time you raised that rate? And what was it before?
It was 160 before, and Courtney will have to help me out with this. I want to say it was 2 years ago.
Okay.
Well, we just raised to 180 on October 1st, and then we raised the remote to match the on-site about a year or two before that. But before that one was a very long time.
Right. Okay. Well, I know the answer for Mauricio because he just raised his rate. What about, I'll go back to Mark Stokes, DTS. When was the last time you raised your rates? You said 150, if I recall.
Yep.
And when was the last time you raised that rate?
It was this last December, a year ago, and we were at 160, and we'll have another increase come in January up to 185.
Perfect. That's exactly what we're talking about. For everybody else on the call here is just remember how your cost to operate the business. You slowly increase. It's not a bad thing to pass those increases along to your customers at about the same rate that you see your costs go up. And then honestly, it gets your customers who do buy a fair amount of labor hours by the hour accustomed to it. That, periodically, it doesn't have to be every year on the dot, but every 1 to 2 years, there's going to be a price increase. Another question for you is, do we have to notify every customer when we have a price increase? Should we be sending out letters? Should we be calling them? How do we notify our customers when we're going to go from 175 to 185? Let's say that's a fairly small increase from a percentage standpoint. We're going to raise our rates $10. What do we do to notify the customers, make sure they're aware of this additional $10 charge?
Send them their next invoice.
Yeah, Tim, since the last call, I've had one person for the first time say something, but I would say that they didn't complain. They just inquired about it, but I did that. Oh, I'm sorry you didn't get the letter, but yep, this is why we raised it, and they didn't.
Exactly.
So I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Basically, we don't want to necessarily poke the bear. If you're doing a large increase, like you're raising it $25, and you've got one customer that buys hundreds and hundreds of hours a quarter of T&M work or project work, and they're kind of like you're a very large customer, one of your whales. I think I mentioned this last week as well. Absolutely. Are you going to give them a call? Give them a call. You want to give them a heads up. But for the most part, doing exactly what we've said here is to just change the billing. You don't have a contract with these customers. They are month to month, with the exception potentially of MSP customers. If you put the billing rate for project work in their contract, then you have to adhere to that. But for the most part, we don't need to. A small billing increase 99 times out of 100 is not even going to be noticed by the customer. And if we're not waiting 5 years and then trying to raise the rate by $50 an hour, typically $5, $10, $15 an hour can be easily absorbed, and for the most part won't be noticed by your customer. Find your market's true rate. If you think you know what it is, then prove it. If somebody says to me that 150 is the max that they could bill, what we would challenge them to do is to raise their rates to 160 or 165 and see if they get any calls. And if they don't, like most of us do, we've done this, gone through this process, the answer is usually 0 or 1 in terms of the number of calls we get from customers when we raise rates. And if that's the case, then the only way, if you do start to feel some pushback from clients, then you stop. But we always say, raise your rates, raise them with some regularity, and that's the way that you prove to yourself that I am getting the market rate. Another good question is, would we ever bill $450 an hour for our services? The answer would probably be no. But technically, that's what we're doing. We're billing 15 minutes and we're able to get, and this is an egregious example, but let's say that somebody has an emergency, but you get out there and it only takes 15 minutes to get everything back up and running, and you bill them $150 plus a $50 trip charge. Well, guess what? You just billed them $200 and they were happy to have it because it was an emergency. You got your stuff, them fixed, they're back up and running, and you just billed them $200. But it was only technically 15 minutes worth of work. So that's, you do the math on that, that's $800 an hour if you extrapolate that. So understand, it's not necessarily, we're not lawyers, we're not folks who are really billing time. We're billing for a result. And if I get out there, fix your problem, and I tell you it's going to be the $150 minimum charge plus the trip charge, and you're back up and you get me back up and running, I'm going to be perfectly happy to pay that. It's about the completion of the project, the completion of the remediation, for the dollar amount that I'm asking you to pay or you're asking me to pay. The result is what the value is. We're not necessarily doing the lawyer thing where we're billing in tenths of an hour, and it's purely based on time. We are selling an outcome. And if you think of it that way, then all of a sudden is it 57 minutes or is it an hour and 10 minutes? And how does that change how many dollars I'm going to bill? Ultimately, if you fix the issue and you hand them a bill for $200 and they're like happy to have paid it because you got them back out of the hole and they're back up and running, then that value is there. We have to be careful not selling to ourselves and making sure we don't tell ourselves, no, we can't get this rate. No, I shouldn't raise rates. I'm sure I'm charging more than all my competitors and I couldn't possibly raise my rates again. Test the theory by raising your rates anyway and just seeing what happens. Don't wait. I think everybody on this call has said that I've asked anyway, has said they raised their rates within the last year to year and a half. So I think you're good. If it's been more than that, if it's been 3 years since you last considered a rate change, then absolutely, first thing I would do after I get off this call is consider looking into a rate change. Then what is the right billing rate? How much do we need to charge? I ended last week with this, and before we had comments, we put up this slide and said, here's what we need to do. Statistically, this is what the ratio is. It is if we have $30 an hour as a base rate, no benefits or taxes, but just the base technician rate of $30 an hour, then we need to bill about 140 to obtain this 40% contribution. It's between 4 and 5 times what the technician's rate is after we pay all the bills to get what the best in class in terms of the 20% doing it the best in terms of profitability get 40% contribution. That means 4 out of 5 of us don't obtain this, by the way. When we analyze your business, we'll be able to tell you what your profitability is on hourly rates, but it's about 4 to 5 times your average technician rate. In this case, we're looking at $30 an hour. We need to bill about 140 to get that 40% contribution. Now, how do we get there? This is how it breaks down. Sales price is $140 an hour, and we're paying $30 an hour to the technician. Here's how, when we look at all the financial statements for TAG members and everybody who's selling time by the hour, this is really where it breaks down that the highest performers are doing. We basically incorporate this. We look at all the hours that were worked over the year, and we break those out into their various components. When we look at this, we say that the technician rate is $30, but we have a downtime cost. And we're going to talk about downtime in about 5 minutes here when I get through this. But what this means is that we are going to have those times when it's slow, times when we have meetings, which we pay for. We have technician training, which we pay for, that are not customer facing. We have working on the internal network at our office. We have doing office work. And then we have things like PTO and holidays and those kinds of things. Ultimately, what happens is we have to pay roughly 4 hours to get 3 hours of productive time. There's always an accounting of the downtime, which is usually 25% of the time we pay our employees is to do something that's not customer facing. I'll get more into that and how we calculate that in a moment, but essentially that increases our cost to deliver that hour by $10. $40 of net cost in the technicians. Then we have about $20 in the cost. About 50% of that is the cost of the support folks, the dispatcher, project engineering, ops management, those kinds of support roles that keep the operations team running. Then you've got labor load, the taxes, the benefits, the insurance, all those kinds of things. And you have potentially perks or bonuses. And then we also add a little, it's been going down a bit as we do more work remotely, but we do have trucks or vehicle costs when we do have to actually roll out and go on site. So all of that adds up to about $70 when we add it up. The technicians, including downtime, the cost, related cost of all the support folks, the technician perks and training, the labor load, the vehicles, it really runs up to deliver that 1 hour of labor is going to cost you on average about $70. So now you got 50% gross margins on your labor hour. If we've got 50% gross margins, then what? Okay, well, we've got to have our sales expense. Sales expense on T&M work typically runs about 10%. That's because we pay commissions on some project work and some T&M work, but not all. Sometimes we have customers that call in and we send someone out and there's no commission involved. So we're going to allocate about 10% in sales expenses, so about $14 out of our 140. And that gives us the 40% contribution that we would like to have. That's what the best among us in the business are doing. And they would keep about $56 of that 140 or 40% before overhead. If we include a 15% overhead allocation, that's another $21. So ideally, if we can net 25% to the bottom line after overhead, we're doing about as well as it can be done in the business. In this case, that would be about $35 out of the 140. That's how we get there. What's the impact of this higher pricing? Remember how last week we showed you that if we manipulate the correct minimums, the correct billing increments, and we charge trip charges, that impact of higher pricing drops straight to the bottom line. Because even though costs will increase over time with raises and other expenses that creep up, when we first raise our rates, we typically are going to have the exact same cost today that we had yesterday, would we not? The impact of higher pricing that we get, or the more revenue from having a 1 hour or 2 hour minimum instead of a 30-minute minimum, if we have a 30-minute increment instead of 15 minutes, or or an hour increment instead of 30, all those things add more revenue. The more revenue we have, typically the cost to deliver that hour of labor are not gonna change right away. It'll creep up over time because costs increase, of course, but it drops to the bottom line. Remember, that's how we got to showing how just getting another half an hour plus a trip charge increased our profit by 67% in my example last week. Well, obviously the same thing goes for higher pricing. If we had a billing rate of 140 and we did a 10% increase, and I wanted to use around 10%, but that gives us $154 an hour from 140. This is a 10% price increase. How much profit does that deliver to us at the end of the day? Well, all the costs are roughly the same. We would have roughly a $70 COGS. The sales expense and G&A would run about $35. And remember how we said we would end up with about $35 in profit in EBITDA, but now we build an additional $14 for that 1 hour of labor. So now we've got $49, not $35. Essentially 100% of that price increase is really going to drop to the bottom line. So now we have an EBITDA of 35 points, an additional 40% more profit with a 10% price increase. That's the benefit of raising prices when your costs are fixed, is that the bulk of it will go to the bottom line. Same thing here. What if we got a little more aggressive? And actually, I'll point out to you, Mauricio, that if you have raised your rates to 175, and I would love to take a look at where you were, let's say the first 9 months or 10 months of the year, and then look at the next 6 or 9 months after you start billing that additional $50 an hour. And I think we could quantify how much money, based on how many hours you sold, you actually made for yourself when you've had that in place a bit. So I'll be really interested to see how we did with that.
Good.
So what if we got a little more aggressive and we had a 25% increase? We raised the rates by, looks like about $35. Yeah, $35. So it's a 25% rate increase. We have roughly the same cost. And that actually increases our profit by 100%. If we do a 25% rate increase and all the other costs in the business are along the lines of what we've shown here, you are going to double your profit on that hour of labor. That's what we really want to get to. When we're doing hourly labor, the three legs of the stool really are, what is my hourly rate and when was the last time I raised it? But if I don't raise my hourly rate, I can make sure I have the optimum setup with billing minimums, minimum time, and billing increments. And maybe even a fourth leg of the stool would be making sure we charge a trip charge. So we're going to spend the time to go do the work. We want to make sure that we are at least as profitable as we can. If we're charging the right rates, the next step would be to discuss how we manage cost. And I'm going to do that in a moment. But that kind of ends this little section on hourly rates. The hourly rate, the billing increment, the minimums, and the trip charges, all those things really go into that piece of it. I'll talk about controlling costs in a moment, like I said, and I'm going to talk about how we do the other side, which is T&M, which is time and materials. Briefly, I'll talk about materials and how we maintain profitability there as well. But now that I'm going to stop real quick, I know I've thrown a lot at you. Any questions on the things we discussed last week and this week regarding hourly rates? Any questions?
I do have a question. Now, are most of you charging a travel charge and then charging a differently hourly rate once you get on site? We start billing at the point of dispatch if somebody's going on site, and we charge our hourly rate at that point.
Okay, so you're billing for travel time included?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's another way to do it. You're essentially, what we call that is kind of portal to portal. Typically what most often I've seen is that we bill a trip charge locally, a fixed trip charge of, usually it's 25% to a third of the hourly rate. So you might have a $30 to $50 trip charge within town. And then if you're going, let's say, a further distance, if you have a long distance where somebody's actually more than 45 minutes or an hour away, then we bill for the travel time as well. So you just basically bill from the moment they leave to the moment they finish and exit the facility. What sounds like you're doing is you're just billing portal to portal on everything, including in-house, in-town deals. And that works as well, because essentially you're billing for 100% of the time. What we found is that in some cases, that's harder to sell because, competitors might not be doing that. But if it's working for you, I would say it's essentially a fine replacement for a trip charge.
Okay. It seems to be working fine here. I mean, one of the reasons, and actually, we looked at our marketplace where everybody's rate was and tried to put ourselves kind of in the middle. One of the things we were finding, we did have a lower rate a couple of years ago, and we were getting a lot of time material customers, and those end up being a lot of time on the phone discussing them trying to negotiate their bill.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that's one of the reasons we actually increased our rate, start focusing on a different level of clientele.
Yeah. That's a great point. So a great point is ultimately, would we rather have every customer on a managed services program in IT, or have them on a partner program for a voice, or having them on hosted system where we're kind of including service? Obviously, we'd much rather have them on that. Obviously, project labor is a little different, but remediation, there's good money to be made in charging by the hour for remediation. But typically, we would rather move customers to a recurring model depending on what we sell them. Will we still do T&M? Absolutely. But as we get a little more, I guess, further away from it in terms of the core pieces of our business, as our recurring grows, it's less important. So what that means is, okay, if we're kind of like in the position where we don't really want this business as much anyway, we would much rather have them be on a partner plan. But I guess if we'll do T&M type of work for any customer, we're going to do it. Here's our rates, here's our minimums. And you're not terribly concerned if they try to go find someone else who will do it for $10 an hour cheaper. You're okay to a certain extent letting that business go if they don't want to play by your rules. Now, if T&M type of billing is 40 or 50% of your overall revenue, you need to be a little more circumspect on it. But as we grow the recurring side of our business, we'll still do T&M, but we're able to more confidently project, hey, this is minimum, this is our billing rate, this is what we want to do. Now, in your case, when you say you're billing time from dispatch, the only thing I would say that comes into play that could be problematic for doing that route is what if you're located on a street and a customer calls you and he's located 1 block away, but you dispatch somebody that's on the other side of town and you end up billing them for 30 minutes of travel time. You get a phone call and they're going to complain that, well, wait a minute, I'm half a block away and you're charging me for, half an hour travel time. And typically you'll probably write that off and say, okay, well, we'll take a little bit off for you because, you don't want them to have a bad taste in their mouth. But that's one of the tripwires with travel charges. Sometimes we would, potentially charge somebody that's an hour or trip charge. It all kind of evens out. You might end up actually better off because the market has shown that the $40 trip charge is palatable to your customer. Therefore, we should go ahead and charge it to everybody, regardless of where they're at. What ends up happening is it gets a little bit difficult to charge for travel time in situations where folks are going to end up, it's not their fault that your technician was on another call way the heck out on the outskirts and they end up with an hour bill, but the person was only there for 15 minutes and the other 45 was travel time. If it's working for you, I wouldn't say you necessarily have to change it, but I would say the far more common model would be to have a reasonable hourly rate with a trip charge. If you roll a vehicle, you charge a trip charge, and it's the same charge for everybody, regardless of where they're at, unless you get outside your metro area. If somebody's going to drive longer than 45 minutes or so to an hour, then you actually do what you're doing, which is door-to-door pricing.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great conversation, guys. I appreciate the questions. This is a short topic. We wanted to talk about maximizing hourly rates and standalone equipment sales. The M, materials and T&M, is sales of equipment. It's sales by the item. It is not inclusive of labor. Remember early on, we talked about bundling the installation of a phone system. We sell the equipment with installation and the labor's included for a fixed price. That's not this. We're just selling standalone equipment. And we all know that sometimes that's not a lot of margin in the IT world, but we can make better margins in some of the other disciplines. Typically, this is IT, surveillance, and voice that we're typically going to occasionally sell standalone equipment. In IT, the equipment is typically sold standalone, not bundled with installation. Who can tell me why that would be? If we're selling a phone system with the installation and for a fixed price, which means we don't get any more or any less depending on how much time it takes, why would we not typically do the same for a large server upgrade or network upgrade, network stabilization, certain projects within that? Why would we shy away from including labor as a fixed cost where they're not going to ever pay you one more penny? Why do we typically not do that?
Control of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're operating within a phone system, which all of your techs have been trained on, and there's a finite known amount of labor, typically, you kind of leave that behind once you get into the server network, third-party product environment.
Yep. You have not had potentially control over that. You don't know the infrastructure they have. You don't know if you're going to walk into a rat's nest of wires in their server room. You don't know what you're going to get into. Now, for the phone, premise-based phone system was a very simple concept that I wanted you guys to understand, even if you don't sell that. And I will tell you that the reason why we can do a fixed price is because we know on average exactly how much time it takes to install those systems. That metric has not changed in the 22 years or so that TAG has been in existence. And we've been analyzing these numbers. It has not. Obviously, that's out the window when you come to IT. So typically, an IT project, we're going to sell them the equipment, and then we're going to potentially give them an estimate for the hours. But we bill usually for every hour that it takes within reason.
Tim, can I ask something? This is Mark, by the way. Hi.
Mark.
I don't mean to interrupt, but so
yeah.
And this is kind of for the group here, because Tim, you know who we are. So let me ask, are you guys selling like servers to new clients that aren't managed clients? And that's a question for the group, or I'm sorry, I'll let you answer.
Any new sales typically are Azure servers or something else that really falls into the monthly category, not necessarily material.
Right, but Mike, are they already managed IT clients?
No, we do still have, and it's very few. I'm talking 2 or 3 that would be buying anything in this fashion from us.
When you say this fashion, like what Tim's talking about?
Time and material, or, here's a good example. We have a customer that's a large association, probably like 60 people. And they have worked with us on the phone system side for years, and then have just kind of tacked on little projects here and there, but we have never been able to get them to go into a full managed service agreement.
Yeah. And to answer your question, Mark, from my perspective, this equates to anybody that's on managed services as well, because if you sign up a new customer, sometimes they need some equipment replaced. So that's going to be separate from the managed services agreement. You're going to say, hey, we have a couple projects here to start to bring your infrastructure up to the modern world. Or you may have scheduled technology roadmap upgrades. You have an MSP customer and say, okay, your server's got maybe a year or 2 left in it, so we'll put that on the calendar for 2022 to take a look at potentially replacing this equipment. And you have maybe you have a map for it. But when it comes time to do it, you're going to sell them the equipment, regardless of if it's a managed services customer or a T&M, dispatch customer, like Mike mentioned, and you're going to charge for the hour for that project. It really equates to both T&M customers and managed services customers on the IT side.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. In IT, we typically sell everything separately. In surveillance, even though we will sell a project inclusive of labor, typically this is replacement parts, small upgrades. Somebody needs a new camera because one's on the fritz. We're selling that equipment separately. So essentially we might have, a replacement for a surveillance camera, or let's say a camera goes bad or a phone goes bad. We sell them a new unit, and we go out and we install it, and maybe we charge them for an hour or two of T&M labor. That's typically what we're talking about here. We're talking about small replacement parts that we sell just separately, exclusive of labor. We might charge an hour of time to do the work, but it's not selling it at a fixed price, which is different. That's usually reserved for the larger premise-based phone installs, hosted handset installs, or surveillance system projects. All these things we sell. How do we basically do our business day-to-day that we would protect the profitability of this? This is pretty simple. There's not a lot of moving parts to it. We sell equipment by the piece, and that driver is to protect the sales expense primarily. Now, in IT, the margins are very tight. We typically see 15 to 25% markup at best. And that the reason for that is typically the pricing can be Googled. They can look up on CDW or Newegg or even Amazon. So usually there's not a lot of markup on the equipment. In surveillance, the replacement equipment that we might sell is better. In voice, it's still very good, actually. We still get sometimes close to a 2.0 markup on replacement units in the voice world. But for whatever reason, we can get what we can get from a sales perspective. In every one of these, when we pay a commission on it, we never really want to pay commission on top line. We typically would pay a percentage of gross margin. Whatever the gross margin is, we would commission a salesperson roughly 20 points on that margin. That way, especially in the IT world, let's say we have a $1,000 box and we mark it up 20%, we sell it for $1,200. Ideally, we don't want to be paying a commission on the $1,200. We would say, okay, what's the gross margin? In this case, gross margin's just the difference between sales price and cost. $200, they would get a commission off of the $200 rather than a commission off the top line. Because in IT, sometimes we have to be even more aggressive with pricing. If you have somebody that's very cost conscious, sometimes you will lower the cost or maybe only have a break even or a 10% margin on the equipment. And if you're paying a percentage of top line, you can end up basically making nothing on that or even be upside down. This incentivizes the salesperson to make sure that they're keeping a fair margin because they're not being compensated on the gross sale. They have to protect the margins in order to get a commission. Pretty simple. That's really the only driving thing within material sales. Essentially, the message is this: is sell at your best price, protect sales expense, and then leave the additional margin that you might need to the hourly charges or the project revenues. What Dale Stein at iNet does is he basically he doesn't argue with the customer over equipment margin. He just says, hey, I'm going to charge 10% above internet pricing for us to spec, order, and configure your equipment, or you can buy it yourself. And what he does is he actually makes it up on the hourly side. So that way it just takes one argument off the table for the customer in terms of something to negotiate. And he said that 100% of the time, the customers say, hey, you go ahead and buy it. He's never had anybody take it up on themselves and say, I'm going to go to one of these distributors and order my own equipment. Typically that works. But in any case, that's kind of the ballpark around material sales.
You know, how many people
topic,
are,
and then we'll wrap it up here. Sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm asking a question again. I'm just curious how many of you lease the hardware?
Different model. I think most folks would be doing it kind of as a service where they buy the equipment and then essentially rent it to the customer. If they lease equipment, it's still a equipment sale to them. So let's say you have $15,000 worth of new servers that have to go in. You negotiate a price, you hand it off to, if you're not the leasing entity yourself, which I know is more common in the copier industry, typically you're handing that off to Great America, a Balboa, a Leaf, a Marlin. you're getting your 15 grand. So on your books, whether you sell it outright or you put it on a lease and the customer pays the leasing company a monthly payment, you're still getting your 15 grand. You're still having, let's say, $12,000 worth of cost, and you're going to make a 20-25% gross margin on it.
Yeah, I was just curious, Tim, how many of your clients out of the 130 you have or whatever, how many actually lease stuff, if you have any idea?
Lease themselves?
No, well, lease through U.S. Bank, Great America, Balboa, whoever.
We do.
We do.
Well,
We do.
everybody does leasing because customers need it. 100% of TAG members will do leasing. There's a small handful of maybe 15% of TAG members actually have the wherewithal to lease their own equipment. Some of the folks that I can think of off the top of my head that essentially started their own leasing company and pumped some of the profitability that they had into a leasing entity where they're essentially leasing to the customer themselves with their own capital. But that's fairly rare, but it happens, if that's what you're asking.
Mark, this is David. We actually find that actually works better on when you're refreshing customers' desktops, laptops. If you sell them a large bundle, set it up on a three-year, 48-month contract, lease contract, and it allows you to approach them at that time for refresh. So it works very well. We do pass-throughs on the service, so you bundle that into one payment for the customer. So that's kind of how we handle things.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dave. And that's what I wonder. We're traditionally a imaging company, copier company, and so we lease 99% of what we do on that side of the business. And about 3 years ago, started leasing pretty much everything we could in IT.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we wrap in the hours. A lot of times we double the hours for projects just because then we don't go back to them and nickel and dime anything. We know we're not going to use all the hours, but it's a lease payment. They're not going to ask. That's why I was wondering how you guys did it.
Yeah, one of the issues we've ran into there is on the copier. We're an imaging company too, so that's primarily what our business still does. But one of the issues we've ran into there is your IT customers aren't wanting to sign a 60-month contract, whereas a copier customer would. We're looking, at especially for refresh on computers, because
Sure.
Somebody that's very very tech savvy, or a company that's very tech savvy, they're wanting to keep a refresh at 36 months. Some of them will extend that to 48, but you rarely can talk somebody into waiting 60 months to refresh their computers. Their computers are limping along at that point.
Yeah, they're pretty. And that's why most leasing companies, they may finance servers over 60 months, but typically they would not do laptops or any kind of, consumer electronics, what they think of that, just because they're financing an asset that's not going to last 5 years. For 5 years, they typically won't do it. But there's plenty of ways to incorporate leasing. From your perspective, if you sell them a bundle of the equipment and you are estimating with the labor and even padding that, you mentioned, you're getting more than enough labor and you're selling it to them for a fixed price, you're getting that dollar amount from the leasing company. So on your books, it would be recorded as an equipment sale and a labor sale, even if the customer was leasing it. So it's certainly a way to do it, but you have to commit to a fixed amount of labor. So as long as you're padding it enough, like you said, to make sure that you're certainly getting more than enough to cover the installation of the equipment you're selling, it's certainly something you can do. You just have to you have a customer that's willing to commit to a 60-month payment typically. If you can sell it on.
Well, and I threw out 60, just some of the bigger servers, servers we do are 60-month, but traditionally, we pretty much have standardized on 48.
Yeah.
We've had a couple recently have been 60.
Gotcha. I'll tell you, that does happen. I would say the vast majority, I say everybody does leasing, but in the environment, if somebody really needed help, they had a huge payment of equipment that they had to replace, and let's say it's super expensive, Typically what they would do is they would finance the equipment and put the equipment on a lease, but they would still bill for the hours to install and configure and get everything up and running would be an hourly charge that they would bill straight to the customer.
Got it.
That's another way for it to work. That's probably more common. If you have a customer that wants to bundle the whole darn thing, the equipment and the installation, and they're willing to pay a premium enough that it makes sure that you don't end up upside down on the hours, then if you have a customer that wants that, I would say that's perfectly fine to do. And in an IT environment and a surveillance environment, CTAP is a viable option. You can bundle in service into the equipment as well and get a pass-through on the lease payment. That's also another option potentially for another time.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me run through. I got the last thing I want to talk about here, and then we'll wrap for the day. I got about 5 more minutes, and then we'll wrap. The hourly rates that we charge, obviously, we have a cost component. Remember, we mentioned we have the hourly rate for the employee. We have potentially downtime where we're actually paying the employee that's not doing something customer facing. And that's okay, because these things are still important. Meetings are important. Training is important. Working on the internal network if we have an issue at the office is important. So this is not inefficiency. It's just we do have time that we're going to be spending or paying our technicians to not service our customers. They're doing something other than. And so we want to basically talk about this from an overall standpoint. This applies to T&M hours, but also just overall across every discipline, how we manage our technicians. We manage technicians what we're going to call downtime, and I'll define that. But how much does it add up to? How much do you spend every year for your technicians to do something other than service a paying customer? It can be a contracted customer with an MSP or some recurring contract customer. It can be project work, it can be T&M work. Those are paying customers. It's in service of a customer that's paying you somehow, some way. And downtime is really the sum of the hours that we pay for, but are not deployed in a productive customer-facing manner. So here's the answer. Approximately 3 months out of every year, it seems like a lot, doesn't it? 25% of the total hours paid are not in service of a paying customer. And that's something that overall we can manage, and I'll give you a quick calculation on just how you can look at that, just to understand what your downtime is. We want to limit that downtime. Basically, no matter what, we want to have this limited to 25% of the time we're paying our customers, or paying our technicians. That just means if I'm looking at it on a daily basis, for every 8 hours that we pay someone, we want to make sure only 2 hours is considered downtime. 25% of the time we pay is going to be something other than reflecting a paying customer. The other 6 hours are what we call deployed. So by deployed, what do we mean? We mean they are actively traveling to or from the job site. This has nothing to do with what we're billing the customer. This is the time that we're logged the activity of the technician. He's actively driving to or from a job site. The time that we're actually doing the work on site while we're there. Anything that we're doing remotely, the time we spend on tickets working remotely. And then the last one would be for large deployments, gathering up the inventory, stocking up the truck, and doing anything that we need to prepare for an install. If it's doing any one of these things in any discipline, whether it's IT, it's voice, it's surveillance, it's cabling, doesn't matter. If you're doing one of these 4 activities, that's what we consider deployed. This is basically any ticketed time spent in service of a paying customer. And if it's anything else, it's unapplied office time, or call it downtime. I don't like using downtime because I don't want to infer that the technicians are not being productive, but essentially that's what it is. What we do is we just say, hey, look, we know that 25% of the time we're going to pay someone is going to be not in service of a paying customer. Doesn't necessarily mean we're inefficient, doesn't mean that the technician is not working fast enough or anything like that. It just means that we don't always have 100% of time that they're there. We have work lined up for them from 8 to 5 every single day. It just doesn't work like that. How do we measure it? This is just one item of several of measuring your technician productivity, and it's determining if we have a utilization issue or not. Here's what a calculation you can do is to pick a data period of at least a quarter, probably a half year is best, and pull the total number of deployed hours. Basically, if you can look into your TigerPaw, your ConnectWise, your Autotask, your eAutomate, if you can determine how many hours did we apply on tickets that were deployed, meaning I was on site working, I was remote working, I was traveling to or from, or I was doing some of that prep time stocking. And this is those times on those tickets that are in service of a paying customer, recorded on those tickets. And then you divide that by the total number hours paid to those same technicians during that quarter or half year or whatever you're measuring. So here's a quick example of how that would work. Is Q1, I paid 10 technicians 520 hours, about 170 hours a month-ish or so. I paid 520 hours to each employee, and I had 10 of those employees. I had 5,200 hours that I paid. That's a fixed number. We didn't pull it out of thin air. That's the number of hours we paid people. If I look at deployed and I have the log reasons set up properly so I can understand, okay, the ticket time is deployed. Oh, wait, here's some time logged to training. That's not deployed. Time logged to managing the internal network at DTS. That's not deployed time. If it's not customer facing, we don't count it. If our time logs tell us that we had 4130 hours, pulled that up and just said, what's a good example? Logged to customer tickets, regardless of whether it's voice, IT, surveillance, and regardless of type, whether it's for an install, it's for a recurring contract customer, or it's a time and materials or project labor customer. It doesn't matter. It's logged to a ticket in a productive manner. Then that results in 79% essentially uptime. Basically, in this case, that's our number. So you can do this for a quarter. You can do this for all of 2020. You just have to make sure you're comparing the number of hours paid and the number of hours logged within the similar time period, and then you're good to go. Basically, if you have 75% or better customer facing, we would say you don't have a utilization issue at this time. You may still have an issue with efficiency of, are we spending an hour and a half and we should be spending an hour? That's something we have to measure differently. But at least in terms of the downtime, when we have time between contracts, time between large projects, or we have all the things that we normally pay with PTO, vacation, holidays, training time, meetings, all these things that we do that we pay for that we don't get any customer facing activity out of. So we don't have an issue, at least with that. That is something that if we measure and manage technician efficiency, at least from a starting point with that metric, at least we know we don't have a downtime issue. Real quick recap of last week, 2 weeks ago, and then today is talking about the hourly rates, the time and materials, both hourly billable rates, whether it's project work or remediation, and then standalone material sales. We want to manage the hourly rates. If we have a technician rate average of $30 an hour as a base rate, we need to do about $140 an hour in order to make a 40% contribution. Utilize trip charges for on-site work. Maximize revenue with billing minimums and increments. Take care to reference the power of increased revenue, because when we do get that increased revenue, it drops straight to the bottom line because the costs are not going to change. Manage your technician downtime, measure it, make sure you have 75% of the time that gets paid is on customer facing tickets. And then lastly, in case of standalone equipment sales, we want to make sure we protect our margins by paying a percentage of the gross margin rather than a percentage of top line. Sorry we took the full hour, but I am still here and I've got some time. If anybody needs to go, feel free to jump off. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you,
guys.
Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.